Hello, you're watching ITU Telecom TV. I'm Martin Warwick and I'm reporting from Cairo in Egypt, where we're attending ITU Telecom Africa 2008. And on this occasion, I'm talking with US Ambassador David Gross, who is the United States Coordinator for International Communications and Information Policy. Quite a mouthful that to say without a card, David. Thanks very much for being here. I'd like to begin by asking you this. I want to talk about Africa. We're here in Africa. We've seen over the past 20 years or so attitudes to Africa changing and attitudes within Africa changing. At the moment, as I understand it, there's about 55 billion US dollars promised in commitments to connect Africa. What has happened over the past 3 or 4, 5 years to change the emphasis so much and to bring Africa to the top of the agenda?
Well, the reason is a very fundamental one. Years ago, when we talked about things like $55 billion or any large amount, we were really talking about aid. In this case, we're not talking about aid. Now, we're really talking about two things. In the area of aid, before I go on to the rest, let me say that there has been a very substantial commitment, particularly on behalf of the United States government, towards Africa. For example, the amount of assistance, the amount of aid that President Bush and the U.S. Congress, and through them, the American people have given to Africa has doubled, more than doubled, just during President Bush's term of office. In fact, President Bush has asked for that doubled aid to be doubled again and has made a request to Congress. So in terms of things such as fighting disease and those types of things that are traditional governmental activities, we've not only stepped up to the plate, but we are really hitting the long ball. But the $55 billion that was talked about at Kigali is not about aid. What that was about is a fundamental change in the way in which companies are now invited to do business in Africa. What Africa has learned is the same as we've learned around the world, which is the way in which telecom networks are best built out in this day and age, particularly with regard to wireless services, is to provide an environment by governments that promotes rule of law, transparency, a progressive regulatory environment that allows for spectrum to be allocated and licensing to be done fairly, and that competition through private sector investment, that is the way in which networks get built out. So when I think back at the beginning, when I became ambassador back in 2001, and I first came to Africa in my new position, having been here many times before as a private citizen, it was still very much the way business had been done for many years. 2001, 2002, it was really a lot of discussions about assistance. And when I met with ministers and talked about things such as the internet and mobile phones and so forth, I got a lot of, frankly, blank looks and questions about why that is relevant and important to the people of Africa. They knew that it was important in the developed world. They knew it was important to people in Europe and the United States and few other countries around the world. But it seemed, as many things had seemed throughout history when it came to technology, that it was only marginally relevant to the people of Africa. Now what's happened is really two things. Technology has continued to evolve in actually extraordinarily fast ways, so that the price of things like handsets, the price of equipment for networks has plummeted. And similarly, as I mentioned before, governments have recognized that if they let the private sector do the work, and instead of using tax money, you let investors use their money, then in fact systems get built and people get connected. So in the year 2000 and 2001, as you look at ITU statistics, virtually no one had a cell phone in Africa, no one had a mobile phone in Africa, and virtually no one was connected to the internet. Today there are something in the order of getting close to 300 million people in Africa who have a mobile phone. That's something in the order of about 30% or higher of the population in a short period of time, an extraordinary short period of time. As you know, Africa now has the reputation of being the fastest growing region in all the world for mobile phones, and it's one of, if not the fastest growing region of the world for internet connectivity. And I predict that the amount of internet connectivity in the area of Africa will grow even faster than wireless, because All those people who are already connected by mobile phones are now being connected to the internet through those phones and through the build-out that's already occurred. Together with the fact that there are now submarine cables being built around Africa, for the very first time to East Africa, thanks once again to good government policies being adopted in those countries. And as a result, what you have is lower cost internet access, and you have really quite extraordinary developments throughout Africa.
I was very interested to hear you say then that this isn't aid and isn't to be considered as being aid, because a lot of the people I've been talking to here in Africa have been concerned about that. In the past, Western companies have come, or Western governments have come here and said, look, we're going to help alleviate the poverty. And they've waved a magic wand over one particular area for a while, and it's made a slight difference. The Africans are now saying, they're now mature enough and sure of themselves enough to be saying, actually, we don't want you to alleviate our poverty. We'll do that ourselves if you can provide us with the technologies and the tools that will allow us to create wealth and to create employment. Do you agree that that's the case and that's what's necessary to do?
Well, I don't know if it's the only, but it's certainly one of the key drivers. There's no doubt about it. Both because of the jobs that flows directly from the industry, of which there are literally tens, if not hundreds of thousands of jobs for Africans by people being employed not only by the telephone companies and the wireless companies here, but also by people who distribute and use those technologies. And then similarly, you look at the incredibly creative ways that Africans, who are extraordinarily entrepreneurial, of course, use mobile phones and the internet to be able to provide a better living for themselves and for their families. For example, day laborers who used to have to search for work and would find it only if they were lucky. Today, the work searches for them because of the ability to have a mobile phone. And someone who has a job and needs a day labor can find them quickly and efficiently. For someone living on $1 or $2 a day, that makes all the difference for them and their family. The same thing for fishermen along the coast, being able to find markets. And in these days where food issues and the food crisis around the world is particularly on everyone's mind, those sorts of efficiencies, both at the high level and at the individual level, at what's often referred to as the bottom of the pyramid, is especially important. And so we see the ICTs, whether it's telecom or the internet or other technologies, being a key driver not only for employment in that sector, but also for employment and efficiencies in virtually every other part of the economy. We've heard here, for example, a lot about every 10% increase in penetration for mobile phones can increase GDP, the gross national product, by about 1.5%. That may not sound like much, but it's actually an extraordinary impact in terms of productivity and an extraordinary impact on the quality of people's lives.
One thing I would like to put to you, and it's a subject which is very often skirted around very carefully in environments and gatherings like this, and this is the almost endemic corruption that's existed in some African states since heaven knows when. It's simply there. It is changing to some extent, but this is something that has to be taken into account. Do you think that increased political stability, better accountability, better regulation and better legislative framework is actually helping Africa to emerge from the difficulties that it was in before? How important is that?
Well, there's no doubt that there's a direct tie between transparency, rule of law, and attracting foreign direct investment. That's not at all unique to Africa. It's true globally. We work very hard with governments on this. These issues are not resolved by happenstance or by coincidence. Rather, they're done by a lot of hard work and help from friends. And the United States has been very pleased to be very helpful to many African countries in this area, whether it's the provision of services to help them design laws, to educate judges on how to judge cases in an effective way, in a transparent way. In the area of telecom regulation, for example, helping to work with the creation of new independent regulators, to be able to give them the capacity to be able to regulate justly and effectively, whether it's technical and difficult issues such as spectrum, or issues having to do with interconnection rates, or a whole host of issues. This takes a lot of hard work, both the U.S. government directly, and I'm proud to say U.S. industry, both again directly and through organizations such as the United States Telecommunications Training Institute, for which there are thousands of alumni here in Africa, I've gone a long way towards establishing a regime whereby foreign investors can feel better about the safety and security of the investments they're making. That benefits the investors, but more importantly, it helps the people of Africa.
Ambassador Gross, thank you very much indeed for the time. Really enjoyed it. Fascinating stuff. Thanks.
Well, it's been a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you very, very much.